Good evening and welcome to episode 45 of Screentone Club. We are recording this on the 1st of March 2020 for release on the 3rd of March 2020. We have just yesterday released our most recent February bonus podcast, which I'm pimping right off the bat, which was on Boogie Pop and others, and I think it was a pretty good banger of an episode. If you'd like to hear it, join our Patreon at patreon.com/Screentone Club. There, for the mere sum of $1 a month, you can get bonus episodes from us. And that money will go straight to helping myself and my lovely co-host, Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
Yes, I'm doing very well. I was hoping to find some kind of way of squeezing the phrase March Madness into this, but I can't, so I failed already. It's a bad start to the month.
Well, I think the main sort of thing about where we are time-wise is where the hell did the first 2 months go? So, yeah, I don't know. I get the feeling I'm saying that phrase more and more. So, yes, I am, in fact, getting old.
Yes, yeah, it is that terrible thing of, I was talking to somebody about something quite recently where they're like, this happened a year ago. It's like, oh, yeah, that doesn't seem like very long ago. And they're like, no, it seems like ages ago. And it's like, there is a difference in our perception of time here that makes me feel incredibly old.
Yeah, I was trying to remember the last time I was in Japan, and took me a while to remember because it both seems like an eternity and 6 lifetimes ago and also last week. So time is both compressed and stretched and nothing makes any sense anymore. Whoops. Anyway, so for continuing our quick mention about the Patreon, we also have our shout-outs tier. I'd like to give a shout-out to Mr. Rob Jessup, who, as always, is supporting us at the lovely tier, and thank you very much for all your support. But thank you to everyone who gives any kind of support. It's greatly appreciated. So, moving on to the fast part of our show is returning champions, and we both have kind of jumped in with a whole big heap of stuff. Do you mind if I get one quick thing out of the way, Andy?
Yeah, go for it.
So, about 4 hours before this podcast was recorded, what feels like the penultimate chapter of We Never Learn dropped, and I'm not going to spoil it, am I? But I just want to put a point out here that in the last speech bubble of this chapter 149. Title drops. It drops the name of the title in conversation, and I just had to sit back and just clap because, good job. You've done a terrible thing of putting the title in the series, you bastards.
When you say what seems like the penultimate chapter, is it actually the penultimate chapter? Or is everyone just assuming that's the case?
That's just me. I'm just assuming that this isn't official. They haven't announced in Jump its ending, but it certainly feels like it because it's chapter 149. 150 is a nice round number. Also, the bowl is now resolved. The who will Nariyuki pick question has been answered, and all that's really left now is just to kind of wave the cast goodbye. So there's that. But yeah, damn good read. And I think the correct person was chosen. So hooray. I'm correct again. Anyway, moving on. We also both caught up on something, where bad decisions are made, at the Mountains of Madness, Volume 2. I want to hear what you think about this, Andy, given that you were previously the Lovecraft virgin of the pair of us when we talked about it last.
We were both pretty gushing in our praise of Volume 1, and I think similarly, Volume 2 is great. It's, as we've said so many times before on this podcast, it's nice to have a story that kind of wraps up in relatively short order. So, 2 volumes is kind of perfect for that story. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, one of the things that we talked about quite a bit in our discussion of the first volume on the previous episode was the artwork, and if you're a fan of those big old 2-page spreads that were in Volume 1, then you will be absolutely gushing with praise for Volume 2 because it has way more of them. It felt like there are points in the second volume that are just kind of a constant stream of very impressive, oppressive or whatever it might be, vistas. That are very enjoyable just to kind of drink in and just enjoy as part of an already kind of stellar art treatment for the entire story. But when it breaks out kind of the big 2-page spreads, it's always good stuff. I really enjoyed the second volume story-wise. I mean, the biggest problem that it has to wrestle with, I think, is that, Volume 1 gets to play with all of the mystery elements of the series to its fullest. It can have it does a lot based on, things that are kind of unseen or unseeable, etc., etc. Whereas Volume 2 kind of has to start filling in the gaps. It has the issue that any kind of story like this, particularly in any visual medium, has, where you've been tilting away with this kind of, unseen enemy of some kind, and then finally you've got to kind of like pull back the curtain and reveal them. And there is a point in this chapter where it goes a little bit kind of like Wikipedia deep lore of like, well, let me tell you about the backstory of this, super ancient cosmic civilization, etc., which was fine. Like, I think it was well done, but it feels like kind of a step aside from the stuff that really kind of grabbed me with the first volume, of just kind of this atmospheric kind of feeling of ill ease that runs so well through a lot of this story. And then suddenly we're kind of into big kind of, lore dumps that are absolutely necessary, but they're maybe not kind of the most interesting bit of the story. But thankfully kind of, once it's gotten that out of the way, you have kind of almost a bit of a good old fashioned kind of Indiana Jones-esque, oh no, we have to escape from the thing. But it still manages to pull things around at the ends to have one last kind of big unsettling kind of moment that it allows to kind of linger over the end of the series of like, despite everything you've been shown and everything that you've now witnessed, there is still something even more unspeakable that is kind of left in the background and kind of left as the overhanging threat over kind of mankind and the planet effectively, which is kind of a really effective way to end that story. Of just like, the micro story of what you've seen and kind of the group of scientists you've been following is over, but there's still the feeling that like, hey, there's something even worse out there that, is kind of unknowable to everybody else. And I think that's a really good way to close off that story that left me feeling satisfied in the end.
Yeah, that was always kind of the feeling of Lovecraft original works themselves, where it's a case of like, this isn't something you defeat even so much. It's just a threat that now exists that I bet you wish you didn't know about this anymore. And that was kind of the background sort of feeling of all those stories. I must admit, the like lore dump Wikipedia element was what I wanted to go in on, because like, for me, maybe it's just, it went both too long and too deep, where while interesting and enjoyable, it's a case of like, man, they are really scraping, like the characters themselves are really scraping this together from little, input, but also there's like too many elements involved in it. Like there's enough elements there that it kind of feels like it's throwing the entire kitchen sink of Lovecraft's world all together to put in this one scene. And it's kind of, for me, that's what kind of made it exhausting of like, hey, you already made this cosmic horror-y. You don't need to add yet more layers to it. You're kind of good. Like having it be unknowable and having like, having there be like basically multiple tiers of unknowable, terrifying threat behind the one you already knew about is far too much. Thank you. So it does kind of make it a nice, way of ending where it kind of rationalizes what's going on with Lake's camp and also what happened there and the aftermath. And it kind of, it does leave it in a much more spooky space rather than just oh yeah, there's an evil thing, whoop-de-doo. You of course see what happened to Gedney, poor old Gedney, poor bastard. And yeah, and as you say, the 2-page spreads are great. Like it has a great amount of like both verve and imagination and consistency, which like, as mentioned in the previous episode, like Lovecraft avoided explaining this stuff too explicitly because it was supposed to be unknowable, encyclopedian and blah, blah, blah. Your memory fills in the rest and your imagination takes you on the wild ride. Whereas when you have to actually draw it as a manga and as art, you have to give it a visual language and a story in the architecture itself. And you can kind of follow along with the characters as they delve into the environment. And it works really well as a result. So that sort of thing really sort of hits home and works extremely well when it could be very easily made completely and utterly hackneyed. So yeah, it was a good read. I mean, I didn't enjoy it as much as the first volume, quite honestly, mostly because it's just a lot more sort of open scope, and the second volume kind of hems itself in quite early, and takes away some of the like broad scope and enjoyable nature of the characters being a bit adrift to, oh, main character is now going to have to work this out, and sort of carves it down a bit. But I still found it greatly enjoyable, frankly. So there's that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like it's kind of interesting when you look at the lore dump stuff, because there's part of me that wishes that I could be a version of myself that could kind of read that volume just with that excise to see how that works, because I suspect it would be just as effective if you didn't know any of that kind of like backstory stuff. But at the same time, I can totally see why it's in there, and there's part of me that kind of appreciates the depth it goes to with that, because I can see why when you've got all of that that kind of material in front of you, that you'd want to use it and put it out there and drop it down on the page, because it's kind of potentially an interesting story in itself. But yeah, it does feel pretty long, especially where it drops in that series, where there's still this kind of this overriding sense of, that there's a lot of peril at hand, and that things are going to go bad at some point, and it does feel a little bit strange that the series just suddenly slams on the brakes and says, but let's talk about this deep history.
Yeah, it feels like almost like it was deployed too late, where the characters have already embarked on a dangerous situation, and then having a lore dump suddenly appear is like, hey, you guys have something else to worry about, like, what is this? But yeah, no, I greatly enjoyed it. As you say, the art is completely stonking great, from beginning to end. I may yet sort of get the author's other adaptations, like the one that won the Eisner, The Hound, and other stories. So yeah. Also, on a complete tangent that's not manga related, the movie The Color Out of Space is coming out, or came out recently, which is another Lovecraft story, and is in fact my favorite one. And it has Nick Cage in it, so it's going to be good. If he brings any of the energy he had in Mandy, we're all set for a great old time at the cinema. I haven't actually watched it yet. I plan to, but we'll see. I mean, I have hope, because I love that story. Even if it is a story that makes you want to vomit afterwards in fear. It's actually very affecting. At least it was when I read it last.
Yeah. I've heard good things about that adaptation, so I suspect if you're a fan of the book, it is probably worth checking out.
Totally. Now all we need is a manga adaptation of Mandy, and we're off to the races. God. Anyway, moving on. I also read If I Could Reach You, Volume 2, which is the like pseudo Yuri drama. And I think I kind of tipped my hand when I complained to you, Andy, over WhatsApp about it when I was reading it. You kind of got my live streamed thoughts because I got annoyed. Yeah, I see what you mean about this having some interesting ideas, and Kuro in particular being a very fascinating character. The kitchen sink drama that rears its head at the very end of the second volume can go do one, quite honestly, and is really just lame. Also, like, after it spends an entire volume getting to sympathize with Kaoru and actually really kind of get down with her and really enjoy her point of view, and like, what she does all day, and how she copes, and her particular like own emotional sort of turmoil. And then at the end of the volume, they're like, check it out. Here's some like, frigging Shortland Street level soap drama. I got very annoyed, and I'm not going to bother with the third volume at this point, unless it's on like deep discount sale. I'm done. Like, no, fuck off. Like, I did not like that particular sort of twist. It sucked.
I think that's fair enough. Like, I think that the thing that will probably keep me driving on for at least kind of one more volume post like volume 3 is I just really like a lot of the characters enough that I kind of want to see where they wind up and how and if they make any kind of progress. And it's kind of one of those series where I think it manages to sidestep a lot of its issues for me, just because I managed to invest myself in those characters. But like without that, I think it's really kind of a bit of a struggle to recommend too highly.
Yeah, I must also admit that, like, this is kind of, the problem is, like, because I messaged this to you already, Andy, I'm now having to relitigate it for a podcast, but, there's a bit, Kuro, when her backstory becomes available and you learn more about her and her particular sort of, like, basically her romantic situation or, like, relationship situation is fascinating, but as I kind of thought after I messaged you about it, like, I feel like that story is completely out of its depth in that series. Like, I feel like what it's trying to do with Kuro there and the other character whose name I've forgotten, is that is a storyline way beyond the reach of this author almost. Like, that sounds a bit cruel, but I think that the story that Kuro and her relationship sort of status entails is like way more advanced than is able to be shown in this series. And that kind of sucks, because it just feels kind of shameful. Also, like, like mild spoiler, but she's basically made a 14-year-old her indentured servant. And while the meaning and some of the like interactions behind that are interesting and pure, that kind of caught me up of like, oh, hang on, this is actually messed up. Like this actually is messed up, even if it's dressed up, and it could be a very fascinating thing that is punching way above where this series can basically hang, at least in my mind. Maybe I'm being a bit cruel, but that's just kind of my thought on that. I obviously don't want to spell it out because I think it's definitely worth actually. That was what kind of got me sort of got me going on the volume when I was reading it, going, oh, this is like, you're not pulling it off, but I totally enjoy what you're driving towards here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something interesting and unique, and yeah, it's one of those things that because it's something a bit different from the norm, especially for this kind of series, like I'm kind of willing to give it plenty of rope to hang itself with, because yeah, like it is going to be a difficult thing to pull off. I think you're probably right that it is going to prove to be like over and above what the author is capable of, given what some of these later volumes do elsewhere. But like, I'm interested to see whether it's something. I'm interested to see whether it's something that even really gets kind of revisited in any kind of depth. Because if there's one thing that has been a bit frustrating with this series, it's that it picks up some interesting ideas and interesting characters and then just kind of sidelines them, and there's never any sign as to whether it's going to really dig into those kind of events or characters again or not. And I feel like, again, Volume 4 might be the make or break for me, where if a lot of that stuff continues just to be ignored completely, that there's going to be a point where I'm just going to get too frustrated because it set up some interesting things that it's then just abandoned.
Yeah, I feel like it's almost like 3 for free on interesting side characters at this point. Actually 4 for 4, because you've got Kaoru included. Like, you've got all these interesting side characters, and Uta herself can be interesting, but just the combination thereof and the frame story there within just doesn't seem to help them shine. Again, maybe I'm being mean, but again, it is also partially because I got really into the Kaoru story arc in the second volume. And yeah, anyway, enough about that. As I say, I'm going to wait to hear what you think about Volume 4, so you can step on that particular landmine for me, Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, I suspect that I will.
Cool. And so, on to my last returning champion, which is kind of a bigger one. It's the volumes of Silver Spoon, volumes 2 to 12. I have volume 13 downloaded, but I haven't read it yet. That's my treat for after this podcast recording, with a cup of tea or maybe a mug of cocoa or maybe some pizza. Oh, reference. So, Silver Spoon, I love dearly. We've talked about it at length. We had that big gushing review about it. I'm not here to say that it gets quote unquote bad. I'm not going to say anything bad. In fact, I think it's as charming as ever. The anime covers a lot of ground, and it's not until basically like volumes 8 to 9 that you actually get free of the anime material. Which is not a complaint. It's just, that's how it is. Like, the manga is luxurious and the anime covers its material well. That's a win-win. I'm trying to make sure I'm padding out so I don't immediately sound bad when I say that there is a transition in this series that happens around volume 11, which is not a bad thing. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's the best thing ever either. It's not like it suddenly turns into a shonen battle manga or they get stands or whatever, although that might be interesting. Maybe I should write that fanfic. Anyway. So, volume 11, Silver Spoon, there's a transition that happens. There is an inflection point. Basically, and this is not a spoiler, so whatever. They get to the end of the first year of their school life, and this is kind of an important thing because now they've done a full tour of duty of the school and a year in the life. So, you're done. Like, you've done the year's tour of duty. Hachiken has grown a lot as a person, and he now has his eyes on the future, and he's starting to, without having to talk about it directly, he's starting to wrestle with his dreams for the future. And this is where the series starts to time dilate. Again, not bad, it's just different. Where suddenly time starts skipping a lot more. There's a lot more time between events, like just natural, because you know the background information of how they are living and what they're doing. And some of the other things are getting resolved, like Hachiken is starting to talk more of his parents, although, frankly, it's mostly glare at them, honestly, still. His mum's a sweetie, she shows up more, she's great. But, so basically, at this point, the Silver Spoon is a 15-volume long series. It is now finished in Japan, and the last volume comes out in a few months. And basically, volume 11 onwards is the ending route. Like, it is so far for volumes 11 and 12 and what of 13 I have read a few pages, it's now on the long, slow, like, resolution road where there is an ending in sight, and at least for myself, I basically know exactly what that is going to be, barring some travails in the interim, which feels weird. Like, it feels weird that I'm basically reading 5 volumes of not an epilogue, but basically a denouement where like the ending is in sight and the characters have the tools to make it happen, and things will happen to make that bumpy along the road. But it's just kind of wild that it's like, oh, this just feels like a really long ending, which is, I'm still enjoying reading it. I still love it, but it is a very strange change in pacing and basically just mood of the series after the entire previous 11 volumes of Hachikin grasping to make any kind of space for himself inside his own life. So yeah, that's kind of Silver Spoon. Again, love it dearly. Great series, but really strange inflection point and change in tactic towards the end. But again, still love it. Art's still amazing. Lovely characters, lovely reaction faces. Mikage is also dense as like lead. So there we are. But yeah, that's Silver Spoon. Greatly reading it. Can't wait to read the rest.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds interesting and kind of logical to go down that route, because I mean, I feel like there are at least a fair few kind of school-based manga that run, and you just end up going through the same cadence of like, culture festival, sports day, etc., and it has to try and find a new pivot on exactly the same thing multiple times and rarely pulls it off. So I guess the idea of just accelerating through the, like some kind of high school match of the day of just like highlights of like, here are the important bits, kind of makes sense to me on its face, but I can imagine that being sort of weird, especially sort of reading it en masse, kind of volume after volume, to have that sudden pickup of like, time is moving a lot faster suddenly. Yeah,
I mean, it makes perfect sense, and like from a writing point of view, it is a sensible thing to do, and it also means that you're not having to basically just hang around these characters forever. The subjective timelines have changed as well, because now there is more for them to do and less of it is new, and so there's just the rhythms to go through. So yeah, it's, as I say, it's I mostly make note of it and call it out so much because it's fascinating, and again, it also actually works. Like, it's working really well. But I mean, you could also take the other tactic of pulling an all-around high school host club where you basically have done a tour of duty of all the school events, and then you do an author's note saying, yeah, time doesn't exist anymore. No one's going to graduate. Nothing's changing. This is just this set of characters. Don't worry about it. Like, they basically just like click their fingers and time unspools. Yeah, which works for that series because it's basically half gag story anyway. And if you try to get rid of two of the more popular characters, then that's a dumb idea. So
yeah. Maybe less good for Silver Spoon when the whole like kind of raison d'etre is, what am I going to do after this? Like, nothing. You're trapped here forever.
Well, it kind of makes sense that actually does happen to one of the characters who, like, despite having graduated, just hangs around the whole time because he kind of missed the boat. But then his arc gets resolved, and that was the point where it all kind of fell into place for me of like, oh, I see the ending now. So, but again, it's great fun. It's still wonderfully illustrated, love the characters, yada yada, all good stuff. Great series, love it.
Cool. Yeah, I will definitely need to burn through that at some point because I've been jonesing to see how that story ends ever since the anime aired, and now it's kind of the end is in sight for the English volumes. I really should get to the point where I can work my way through all of that.
Yeah, it is. As a last note, it is supremely bingeable. Like, is that a word? Whatever. It is extremely easy to binge on. Like, you can I walloped through 3 volumes in a day at one point just because. Whenever I had a spare moment, I was just reaching for my tablet unbidden and reading it, which was frankly a really fun experience. Like, it was really wild. And also, it's a yen press title, so it's not that expensive on Kobo. So it's like $4.50 a volume, which is very easy to justify to yourself when you're just like plonking your card down again.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, cool. So, moving on to the main part of our show. Who wants to go first? You want to go first, Andy, or shall I?
Yeah, sure. Let's lower the tone somewhat and let me go first.
I don't know. Both of these have got a pretty low tone, so
I guess so in their own ways.
Yes.
Yeah, so my pick for this show is very much ripped from the headlines, because my pick is volume 1 of Interspecies Reviewers, which recently and is currently having its airing anime adaptation, which has controversially been pulled from Funimation's streaming service. And certain Japanese TV channels have also pulled it from their schedules, basically for being a little too lewd, even for their normal standards. And so with all of that in mind, and a lot of back and forth kind of going on around this whole thing. Like, I was kind of curious to check out the source material, only to find that Volume 1 is weirdly only available on Bookwalker. Like, I don't know whether there is some kind of, like, some kind of censorship, quote unquote, reason for that, or whether it is just legit that there's some weird oversight. But other services don't seem to have Volume 1 for some reason.
I have both Volumes 1 and 2 on Kobo. I don't know if you checked that site or if I've got a copy and it's just stuck in my library because they're not selling it anymore. I don't know, but I bought Volume 2 a few days ago, so it's still up, I think.
Yeah, like, that's the weird thing. Like, Volumes 2 and 3 are available on Comixology, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to, like, destroy this podcast by, like, checking on that live. Okay, it is up on Kobo again, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it, like, wasn't there for a while, so I suspect it is just some weird admin thing, but of course this series being what it is just, you know, straight down the conspiracy route.
Maybe they're adding a digital Too Hot for TV sticker onto it.
Yeah, quite possibly. So Interspecies Reviewer is the story of a world where many different species have all kind of come together and live in something approaching some kind of harmony. And so, you know, you've got all of your kind of typical sort of monster races, etc., all in one big melting pot. And the series itself follows a human adventurer called Stunk, which is a really good name for an adventurer, if you ask me, who hangs out with a quote-unquote pervy elf called Zell. And as time goes on, they also meet an angel called Karim. And when they're not adventuring, they basically end up having a side gig, for which they really should set up a Patreon, to be honest.
Well, they kind of do have one, don't they?
They kind of do, in a weird sort of, like, kind of Adventurers Guild kind of way. But they basically set up a side business of reviewing the various kind of brothels, for want of a better word, that are rife within this land. And all of these various kind of establishments all tend to focus on a particular kind of species or whatever it is, to kind of give customers a unique experience, as it were. And so the various characters, and there are some other side characters that kind of dip in and out as well. There's usually kind of a group of like 4 of them, visit a particular establishment, see what goes down there, and basically write a review, which, interestingly for a manga, is literally just kind of like a textual paragraph reviews with a kind of score rating out of 10.
It's very Famitsu, if that still plays as a reference.
Yes, it's definitely a little bit like that. I was going to make a joke about like IGN scoring and like they do occasionally score below 0, blah blah blah. So they go to these various places and review them, and like it's an interesting series because, I mean, especially given all the discourse around sort of the anime and what's happened with that. Like, I was expecting this to be a lot more lewd, quite frankly, than it is. Like, this is not a series that is shy about kind of sex and sexuality, like, as it can't possibly be, given its nature, but it's also not really, like, massively explicit either. Like, in terms of, weirdly, kind of the first few chapters in particular almost feel oddly kind of chaste.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah, totally.
It's the opposite of a lot of other manga that kind of lead with their, like, with all the boobs and fan service and then kind of, like, rein it back once they've got, like, readers on board. This kind of almost goes the opposite way, where the first few volumes are pretty kind of low-key and pretty restrained, and then it kind of ramps up more as the series goes on, and it almost gets kind of a bit more confident in terms of, like, I guess maybe we can show a bit more here.
Yeah, it's a weird combo because, like, I realized this when I was rereading it, because my second time reading it, and it's way more chaste because there's no panty shots to be seen. Like, you don't really see boobs for the first half of the volume. And then, you know, it has an entire chapter towards the end riffing on mysterious rays of light performing censorship, which then plays into an extended gag about the brothel of the week they're going to. I must admit, this is tipping my hand a bit, but I read volume 2, and I don't know if they got sign off from somewhere or something, but in volume 2, nipples start appearing. Like, it's almost like someone like tapped them on the shoulder and said, hey, you can be a bit more naughty if you wanna. And so nipples start actually appearing in volume 2. But it still feels extremely, like, I mean, it is chaste because, like, my weird, like, sort of pseudo praise for this series that I'm probably gonna get laughed at for this, but, you know, it takes it seriously from both angles, and, like, it fully appraises sex work as work, which is, like, in a world where it's like, yeah, you know, well, especially in, like, manga and in a world that can be far too sort of up itself for its own good, like, it's nice to see something that's just like, yes, there are brothels. We have this weird workaround to get them legal, but it's a perfectly valid thing that people do. And like Volume 2 introduces a weird peep show thing. But it properly appraises it as labor, and, you know, the prostitutes as workers. And that is good in my mind. Like, I don't know, that kind of helps wash away a lot of its lewdness and contextualizes it very differently, at least myself.
Yeah. I mean, I'm basically with you on that. Like, I think there are kind of a couple of things that make this volume stand out in a good way. Like, yeah, I think one of which is just kind of the fact that it doesn't dance around kind of sex as a topic. Like, again, as you mentioned, like, manga tends to be very kind of like, they held hands kind of about things and never want to take things too far. And it's always kind of refreshing when you find a series that is willing to just go there and be like, hey, like, people have sex, people hook up. Like, you know, it's not all about kind of, you know, love and romance. And, you know, that's why I've kind of enjoyed in the past, like, series like Scum's Wish, things like that are just like, hey, you know what? People just have sex because it feels good sometimes.
And then they get themselves into hilarious love polygons and, oh God, what are you idiots doing? Holy shit, stop it.
Yes, yeah. So thankfully there is none of that here. Yeah, so like I do enjoy that side of things. That it is just very frank, you know, in its appraisal of kind of sex as, you know, kind of a human function and beyond as it happens within this series. And yeah, I think the other thing that I like is that it has taken care and consideration in how it appraises its broader kind of subject matter of sex work and sex as a whole, because it clearly, the thing that I like about this series, I think, from this first volume, is that it feels like it has thought through everything that it presents. And sometimes that can be overbearing in a series. Like, there are certainly, again, having just like talked about like the Mountains of Madness going into like full Wikipedia lore dump mode, like I was kind of scared that at some point this series was going to go full into like deep lore of every species, etc., and kind of like bore me to tears with stuff that I wasn't that interested in. And thankfully it never does that, but it also finds ways of doing just enough to kind of colour in the edges around its world, like beyond just the sex work stuff, that kind of makes it interesting. Like, there's a little moment where you kind of get a bit of a view of sort of the politics of the land, which of course is also like largely based around kind of entertainment and sex, etc. But like it manages to do little things like that kind of give you enough of a big picture to be like, okay, I sort of feel somewhat invested in what's going on here beyond just kind of the actual focus of the series. So I enjoyed that about it. And I think the actual scenarios that it puts together within the volume are also thought out. Like, there's a whole chapter about a particular establishment where basically they can use magic to change your gender. So like, you know, if you're a guy, you can be a woman, or vice versa. And that, in another manga, could go to some really skeevy and uncomfortable places.
Not to mention stupid.
Not to mention stupid. But instead, like, this series at least sets out the ground rules of like, hey, once you're in this establishment and you've had this has happened to you, like, you cannot leave until you have changed back to your, like, original gender. Like, you can't go out and, like, wreak havoc or, you know, do anything untoward. Like, you have to stay within these four walls where everybody knows what the deal is and everybody is comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And it's little things like that where that chapter could so easily have gone out of control in a lot of the kind of ways that this kind of manga traditionally would have, but instead, like, it very deliberately sets the bar in terms of like, hey, these are the rules of engagement for this, and like, it's all actually thought through in kind of a relatively sensitive way that makes it feel far more, again, kind of going back to what you say in terms of it kind of appraising sex work in a sort of genuine way, rather than just being kind of like, you know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink about it. And I think that really actually, like, there's actually really something to be said in terms of appreciating that.
Yeah, I think especially with that gender change chapter, like, that's kind of when I like started to actually enjoy the series a lot more, because it, as you say, like, it made me appreciate that the author had thought it out, but also didn't feel the need to over explain and lore dump the functioning. Like, it started with, this is how this works, this is why it works this way, and I think you'll agree this is a good idea for everyone involved. Like, as you say, like, when you're in this exchange shop, you can't leave, but also, like, if you invite someone in to, like, have to join you, they know what the deal is and they are on an even level. So there's, like, shared information. And again, it's minor, but it is a sort of thing where, like, the series doesn't have to waffle around doing the right thing. It just does something sensible and says, yes, this is all labor and work, and here's how it goes, and here's some jokes as a result of that. Which is, kind of, I think that's also the part of the thing, is that, like, even with, like, Zell, the pervy elf, and Stunk, the adventurer, and, Krim often hangs out. But there's also some other characters, like, there's always 4 people involved in the reviews. And this allows it, like, and also this is what kind of is interesting, is that not everyone is as gung-ho and yee-haw about, like, getting their pole cleaned. It is a case of, like, some people want different things out of it, and, some people, are just there, as a matter of course. Some people are more happy to yell about it, but, they're all there to kind of write a weird review. But that kind of what works, is that not everyone, like, enjoys the same things. And it, even when the text dump sort of reviews, they are very long, and I feel bad for the typesetter and the translator, because holy cow. But those are all really, really thought out as well. And you can read those for a good laugh, but also it's like, oh no, this makes sense. Like, this author has clearly thought about this an awful lot. Even if, like, on a tablet, it was kind of a pain in the ass to read because I had to zoom in and out because the font's damn small. But yeah, that stuff all kind of, like, shows that, like, the author is not playing around, and that's kind of what gives it a lot of its robustness, as even with a on its face stupid premise.
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, even the cast of characters, as you mentioned, are well thought out as well, because there is a broad kind of scope of opinion in there where, it totally makes sense that they've got kind of the right 2 characters who are sort of the ever-presents, and then, the kind of extended cast are very much kind of interchangeable in a way that matches whatever the reviewing question is, to kind of give some interesting kind of, like, counterpoints of just like, no, I didn't like this because X. I feel like it would get kind of boring if it was just, like you say, a bunch of characters who were just being very gung-ho and just like, yeah, this is all great about it. Like, it does a good job of finding kind of counterpoints that actually make logical sense within kind of the world and characters and species involved, that kind of, add a little something to it that is sort of, above and beyond, again, what this series, what you might have expected from the series. Yeah,
I mean, also you have, like, Krim, who is an angel who with a chipped halo, who works in a nearby bar. And this is also one thing, like, jumping kind of in nowhere, but it's also where some of the, like, artistic direction in the series, like, everything's quite, I don't know, like, the halo isn't just like a disc, it's like a donut. Like, everything's quite rounded, which I suppose if you're going to be drawing a series of lots of, like, ass and titties, you kind of want to, like, have a bit of volume on everything. But that's kind of one thing about this series, is everything's usually quite voluminous, and things are more rounded than angular, I suppose. But no, Krim I enjoy as a character because, like, Krim is a hermaphrodite, is an angel, right, presents as male and just presumes himself as male. But, like, he's kind of an interesting character because, like, there's not really this sort of explicit fall from grace garbage. It's just a case of, like, oh, yeah, he got stuck down here, going to work at the bar and maybe sometimes get dragged into these idiots' escapades. And it's kind of, he's both a straight man character and also the comedic relief and also the sensible straight man in the whole thing, and kind of works well as, like, a rather weird sort of, like, fish out of water character, even though you're not explicitly within their viewpoint the whole time. So I kind of enjoyed Krim as a character a great deal.
Yeah, and again, like, given that character's nature and their kind of gender, that was another moment where I was kind of worried that there was going to be a red flag of, like, oh, this is going to get, like, just played for laughs at some point, and it kind of does a little bit, but only very, very mildly. And for the most part, again, I think one of the things that I liked about this volume is there are numerous points where it felt like it was going to turn into a kind of, hey, let's point and laugh at this character because reason X. But actually, like, everyone's just, like, pretty chilled out about, like, hey, you just like what you like. Like, I'm not going to kink shame you or whatever. Just go do what you enjoy. Like, we're all we're all just here to have a good time, and this isn't going to turn into any kind of like shaming session for anybody. And again, like it manages to, of course, it makes like dick-sized jokes, etc., but like what little it does with that is pretty good-natured and kind of like just kept to a minimum. And it feels like this series could go in some cruel directions in places, but it never does that. And again, I think that's something that I was kind of almost half expecting given this kind of series, but actually it never goes there, and that was also kind of a bonus, I think, as the volume went on.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I read volume 2, in fact, a few days ago, because I just kind of eventually used weekend to decide to read it. And the only fear I have is that volume 2, as I mentioned, starts to actually get a bit more explicit because it starts to draw nipples, which, whatever, they exist, they're a thing. But also at the very end of volume 2 brings up the spectre of a possible plot line, which has me actually somewhat shook of like, oh no, they're going to try and do an ongoing storyline in this. Oh God, can the series survive? But we shall see.
Yeah, they're going to close the brothel. We're going to have to become idols to save it.
We have to save money to reopen the youth centre. But yeah, there is a storyline. In fact, the last chapter, that chapter is actually really fascinating because it has a really, really off the wall version of a sex shop, which I'm not going to spoil because it's just kind of weird when you read it, and I don't think you'd believe me if I did tell you. But yeah, that's a really fascinating continuation.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, I think that the one other thing I'd say, like you kind of mentioned how like rounded everything is in the art style. Like I think weirdly the artwork is also one of the things that prevents this series from ever feeling too kind of titillating or lewd, because it's very cartoony.
Oh, like, totally.
Nothing, everything is kind of like over exaggerated and over accentuated in a way that is not, it is very rarely, if ever, made to be kind of sexy. It's almost kind of this weirdly sort of cartoony yet matter of fact of just like, hey, this is what these species look like. This is what, these parts of the body look like, in this kind of exaggerated, caricatured way. And like, it never felt like it was trying to kind of, to titillate in that way. It was, even when it does get to later in this volume and you do start getting the odd kind of nipple here and there, it always just felt very much just like, well, of course, because they're naked, what do you want? And it kind of shrugging its shoulders. Like, it was never going for that sort of, again, the whole sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, hey, look at this kind of feeling. Like, which I think, again, helps me as somebody who's not really a big fan of kind of fan service heavy shows to feel like, this is actually kind of weirdly enjoyable in its own way.
Yeah, it is, as you say, very cartoony, it never really feels very titillating. It just feels more sort of buxom and stupid, like an old picture postcard from the seaside sort of thing. Yeah. So it kind of cloaks itself in that, and I think that's also partially why the anime maybe got pulled, is because it kind of makes a lot of like in between panel stuff like literal and animates it, whereas in a manga you can just skip between panels and you're fine. Whereas in the anime you got to animate that whole damn thing because you've got to fill up the time somehow. And oh god, like we put motion in it, and now it looks horrifying.
Yeah, well, and I think that's kind of the thing, like, that I was curious about to read this series and that became clear is because, much of this manga is very much about kind of the preamble, then the review at the end, which kind of talks just in basic textual terms about what happened during. But again, that's not really something that's going to play in an anime adaptation. So I suspect that's probably kind of where it's been caught out somewhat because, again, this is where I think this series can feel quite chaste, because you get the kind of preamble of like, oh, we're kind of meeting these sex workers at this establishment, and then it's kind of like cut to the review at the end, and there's very little shown a lot of the time of kind of what happens in the middle in this first volume at least. Yeah,
which again like kind of makes it, one kind of keeps it light and moving. I don't know, but one last thing, my last sort of note is that the economy model for the reviews, which is they post them on a message board and people give tips to take copies of them. It's kind of wild when you realize they're making a prostitute zine. That, or they've basically made a fantasy version of a Usenet message board. Like, you got to dial up to your Porno BBS to download the newest reviews. Just something about that setting, just I really find amusing. And like, sure, you could pick it apart, but at the same time, it's like, well, this perfectly justifies it within this stupid world they've generated. I mean, why not? Sod it. Like,
yeah. I mean, maybe this is going to be the incoming plot line that they either find that they have to pivot to video or put this up behind a paywall or something. I don't know.
Well, there is not a spoiler, but like there is an element in Volume 2 when they find out they have competition, and they're like, "What? People are stealing our idea," and then they calm down and say, "Well, it's not exactly very original, is it? Whatever. Like, we've got our own thing to do," and it raises the Spectre of that possible dramatic arc and then squashes it in 2 pages, which again is just kind of a case of like, well, this is fair, whatever. Like everyone else, of course, people are going to like, cheat because, and then of course, other people are going to take the idea and run with it. Like who wouldn't?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like I came away from this enjoying it more than I perhaps expected I would. Like, this was more a pick out of kind of curiosity as much as anything else. And I still don't know whether I'll actually kind of invest in reading any future volumes, but I kind of had a good time with it. Like it was fascinating in ways that I did not expect it to be. And so like I will give it kudos for taking the route that it does for something that it could have gone in a very different direction with.
Oh, totally. I mean, perhaps the biggest like sin it could have committed would be to be boring. Like, if it was just like, oh, check it out, titties, and nothing happens, it'd be like, oh, cool, well done, you made another boring manga.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I guess I was expecting, perhaps not from the get-go, but by the end of this first volume, it would be like, yeah, okay, like, I know, like, the cadence of this, I know what the deal is, but at least for the chapters in this volume, it has enough variety and enough different things to toy with, to keep it fresh and keep it interesting, and it never really felt like it was getting too repetitive.
Totally. So yeah, that's Interspecies Reviewers. Forgot to mention earlier, there's 4 volumes out in Japan. There's 3 in English. The third one just came out like the past week, published by Yen Press. And yeah, as mentioned, check around. Maybe it'll be available on your digital platform of choice. I don't think I walk into Waterstones and buy this somehow. Yeah. Anyway, so, moving on to my choice. Right, moving on to my pick for this episode, it's Chio's School Road. The author is Tadataka Kawasaki, and then published by Yen Press. It's currently 8 volumes out in English, and there are 9 total volumes. They didn't hit the normal 9, they skipped one along. I think volume 9 comes out in a few months from checking it. So you can buy it from most physical and digital stores. I've seen it in my local Waterstones a few times even, which was kind of wild. It previously received an anime like a few seasons ago now. I'm gonna audibly raise an eyebrow at Andy because he'll probably remember more than I do.
Yeah, I think it must have been like around this time last year, maybe. It feels like it's not that long ago, but it's not that recent either in the grand scheme. Yeah,
well, anime timescales are bizarre, let's face it. But I think it was well regarded or well received even. So this is where I kind of put my hands up and admit 2 separate things that are stupid, and I probably should admit. One is that I'm aware of this author from their previous works when they did hentai doujins. Hooray! Which also casts a bit of a shadow over it. So partially I could not get away from the fact that this guy used to do porno, and some of the scenes and situation character drawing in this reminds me very heavily of that previous pedigree. I'm very sorry. This is just my problem. It's my brain. And the second one is that all my notes I wrote for this, I accidentally tossed out yesterday when I was cleaning my flat. So I'm having to go completely off the top of my head. So apologies if I sound even more scattershot than normal. Anyway, Miyamo Chio is a little sod who plays Western video games late into the night, and then ends up waking up late and having to get to school in very short order, and then stupid shit happens that stops her from getting to school. In the first case, she is on her way to school, just about holding it together. She's very tired, and there's a huge stonking set of roadworks with a half a mile redirection, and she thinks, well, fuck it, I'll jump on this rooftop and run across the roofs like in my video games. And of course, this is all about her, a rather sort of stupid and overly impressionable and video game addicted girl, trying to get her way to school in one piece, and also about terminally embarrassing herself. Of course, the joke being that she managed to do some really absurd, dumb crap, while trying to very ineptly parkour herself across the suburbs where she lives. And so, the kind of my crux of this sort of thing is that it's really absurd, this entire story. And also the one thing this series does that makes you totally cool with it is that Chio is kind of a jerk and a sod. And she starts to make very loose friends with one of the cool kids from school who is extremely patient and very understanding and more than a little naive. And you kind of think, bless. Meanwhile, Chio herself is a little sod, as mentioned at the roof of the show, a sit-up review, which, for me kind of helps the whole thing go down because you don't feel bad about all this bad stuff happening to Chio because it's her own goddamn fault most of the time. And also you wouldn't mind her getting some comeuppance at some point. It's got very vibrant, active drawing, which kind of plays into it. Again, some of the moments come across as a little steamy, but again, this might be my brain poisoned mind who remembers this guy from doing hentai. And it generally sort of moves at a very rapid pace. Like, I was kind of slightly dreading reading this because I bought it when it was in Japanese and I read through it and thought, this looks fun. Like, this is a really goony, stupid thing by a guy who I knew from another world. And it works really well translated, which is the pleasant thing. So it's a very quick, rough read. Like, you kind of burn through it quickly because it's all very kinetic, very fast. It's all very stupid and goony and, Chio coming across new idiot problems and trying to navigate things like both like social mores and her idiot terrible friend and trying to get to school. And the whole thing kind of works. It also helps that the entire series is basically situated in this magical liminal space between basically her computer and her gaming PC and her Rat9 mouse and the school gates. Like, it limits itself and it doesn't try and make it this like it sounds mean, but I love the series Bento, but at the same time, that series, when it starts to have like a wider universe, it falls apart because it all seems really stupid. Whereas when it's just a bunch of characters trying to get cheap sandwiches from a store when it's closing time, that makes way more sense. And Chio's School Road keeping itself to this space between the front door and the school gates works really well because it allows you to kind of abdicate the rest of the setup and the rest of the character, and it's just them during this one stupid 15-minute period in their life that they constantly get wrong. I feel like I just went a mile a minute there, so apologies. But what did you think of it, Andy? Like, did you enjoy it? Like, I'm kind of light on it because, as I say, it kind of went by for me real fast.
Yes, yeah, I think it is definitely, it's quite a light read in that sense. Yeah, I burned through it kind of equally fast. I mean, I kind of liked it. I mean, I do really like its art style and kind of the visual style of it. Although, kind of interestingly, like even without the prior knowledge that you had of the author's sort of previous endeavors, I did also just get that feel of like, if I'd have been asked, like, would you pin this person as somebody who previously like drew hentai, I would definitely have pegged them like, yep, absolutely 100%.
Yeah, the blushing and the weird huffing is kind of the hallmark, honestly.
Yeah. Like even without that prior knowledge, I was definitely there of like, yeah, I bet if I did some digging, I could find some interesting prior works of this person that will definitely not be going on any like legit digital platforms anytime soon. So yeah, like I did get that feeling, but I do really like the visual style, like, particularly for a series that is about kind of like traversal at the end of the day. Like, it has a really active looking style to it. Like, it feels very active and very vibrant. And I think that actually really works in its favor. I think the biggest issue that I had with it is what I will dub the NICHIJOU effect of this series takes a good idea for a skit, and it just always takes it just that little bit too far to the point where it starts to wear thin for me. Like, it feels like a lot of the scenarios in here could probably have stopped just like, maybe just a gag or two or a page or two earlier, and I would have been on board, but it always just takes it just beyond that tipping point where I just kind of start to get bored of the premise and want it to do something different, but it just continues to hammer on it just for that teensy bit too long that kind of turns me away from it. And that was kind of the thing that did this for me a little bit, kind of chapter on chapter, is it always just seemed like it just went that extra step of just like, I'll just squeeze in one more joke, and that was always the point that kind of lost me in terms of that just being a little bit too far for me.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Like, I think there's a moment in the first chapter even when like there's this rich arsehole basically who like does some really stupid shit and gets his comeuppance. And at the same time, it's like, oh, you kind of like you went back to the well one too many times, as you say. Like, it really hammers home the fact that guy's a prick, like, once too many times. And by that point, the joke's already kind of sailed and you're just waiting for it to kind of move on, but it still resists and refuses to move on with the story. So yeah, the fact that it does, as you say, continually just kind of reside too long in the joke. And especially because, like, usually that last instance is the most extreme and stupid version of it, where it's like, here is the punchline. It's like, well, no, for me, the punchline was the previous iteration that was still somewhat reserved and restrained and not as gross out stupid as it is now. Like, for example, when they end up, like, Chio and her idiot friend end up, like, stalking someone they know from school through some side streets, which just seems badly considered all around, really. And of course, it was going to end in a stupid way. And then when the chapter's over, you're like, well, that was just kind of bad. Like, it was just kind of a really stupid combination of things you all did. Like, maybe you lot should learn.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe as much of it as just it going on too far. Is that, like, yeah, it's always just that step beyond into just, you know, I'm all for a bit of kind of absurdist humor, but it always just goes that extra mile to just be like, well, no, that's just too absurd for me now, and it just kind of like breaks the immersion almost in a weird kind of way. So yeah, like I know there are definitely points in this that sort of made me smile, or I seem to recall kind of, you know, at least having a bit of a giggle once or twice, but then it was always that feeling of just like, it just pulled it that little bit further to the point where I was just like, oh yeah, I'm kind of done with this now. And so it just always left me feeling a little bit deflated come the end of a chapter. Yeah, it kind of, I kind of agree. It's very much a case of like, there's some gold in here, but man, is it just kind of like stuck. Yeah, which, I don't know, it's kind of a shame because, as I say, I kind of burned through it in very quick order, and at the end it's like, well, that was fun, but man, I wish I could, it's a weird series as a result, because once it starts to feel its like pacing and its kineticism in the last half of it kind of improved a lot, but even so, it still doesn't know when to let a gag go. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think like Chio herself is like, as you mentioned, like a good protagonist for the series, because there is this weird sort of balancing act that the series has between like you kind of wanting her to get a comeuppance for being kind of an idiot and a bit of a jerk, but there's also that part of you that just kind of can't help rooting for her, and that sort of like helps each chapter kind of run along, because to start with you're like, oh no, like I hope you can pull this off, and then you kind of see her being a bit more and more of a jerk as whatever scenario it is plays out, to the point where you're just like, when it all does go horribly wrong, then you're kind of also at the point of being like, good, like she deserved that. And I think it does a good job of kind of splitting the difference there, of just like not making her completely incorrigible to the point where you just kind of want her to fail immediately, but also to the point where you're kind of well and truly behind it when it does all fall apart.
Well, yeah, I think it's mostly because it is like so self-inflicted most of the time, and like, well, it's your own damn fault. I mean, you know, I know you're an idiot and it's not your fault you're an idiot, but don't be an idiot. I don't know. It's kind of that good combination of like, you want to root for her, but at the same time, like, it would be easier to root for her if she wasn't such of a moron. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I kind of have that's it. Like, I'm kind of flailing a bit because it's like, oh, that's kind of it. Like, it was over fast, and it has some nice visual elements when, as I say, the momentum is going, and it has some interesting combination, especially when it's like Chio's mind image of how things will go versus how it actually goes, which, you know, is kind of a recurring visual gag that works well. And after that, it's kind of, it is what it is. It's a dumb gag comedy that outstays its welcome quite often, but also has some fun action and good comeuppance, and that's kind of it at this point, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, it's very much. This is very much, I think, one of those series where it's kind of, it does exactly what it says on the tin. Like, if you probably read the back of volume synopsis and kind of look at the cover artwork, then that probably tells you everything you need to know in terms of like, oh yeah, this looks like something I like, or this doesn't look like my kind of thing, and chances are you'll be right. Because yeah, like it's a pretty light touch. Like, it is just a comedy. It doesn't really have anything kind of, you know, to shout about beyond that. And yeah, it's fine at what it does, but it's very much a kind of like, yeah, kind of glad I read one volume, but not something that I'd stick with beyond that.
Yeah, not for 9 volumes. I think, if anything, I might, if I can find some time, I might visit the anime, because it'll probably work quite well in an animated form, especially if it can nail the like madcap sort of pacing of the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to recall whether it was like a short series where it was just like short episodes as well, because I mean that seems like a fitting way to do this, of just, you know, having short vignettes, just like cover a chapter and then you're done and then on to the next thing.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, that's Chio's School Road. That's kind of it, I'm afraid. we kind of packed the interesting series up front, perhaps, but hey.
Yeah.
But, you know, after Interspecies reviewers, where do you go? Like, it's like, oh, everything seems quite boring and staid right now. Weird. So anyway, moving on, what we're talking about next time. So, I have picked, the Shonen Jump hot property of the moment, I suppose, of, Demon Slayer. Both of us have, Shonen Jump subscriptions. So, you know, read up until when you're sick of it and we can talk about it. How's that?
Yep, sounds good to me.
And how about you, Andy?
So to keep on the cheerful comedy tone, I've picked a new work from Inyo Asano, the first volume of which is out now, and that is Downfall, which I've seen people kind of talking about, and it sounds super interesting, and plus it's Inyo Asano, so I'm a sucker for it. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that.
Yeah, I read a really fascinating article about it by someone like dissecting it, and it already sounds interesting. So that'd be cool. There's also, at the time of recording, there is a Inyo Asano sale on Comixology. I don't know if it will still be present when it comes to the release of this, but it did have Goodnight Pun Pun on sale, which is, I'm not touching that one for a while, I must admit. But yeah, we'll see. So yeah. Okay, so thank you for listening. If you want to hear our previous episodes of the podcast, you can go to screentone.club, our website. If you do like the podcast, please consider telling a friend, tweeting about it, etc. That stuff is really helpful for getting the word out there and getting more people to listen to the podcast. Like, word of mouth is still the secret sauce, as it turns out. Ratings, reviews, especially, very well appreciated. Thank you very much to all those who already have. As mentioned, we have a Patreon. That helps fund the show and keep us independent, and also pays for the manga and keeps us free of advertising. So if you'd like to have a look at that, go along to patreon.com/Screentone Club. As mentioned at the top of the episode, we have our most recent bonus episode on Boogie Pop and Others. Jesus, my brain fell out of my head. Boogie Pop and Others, the light novel. I may have to change that episode to add some corrections, because one of our lovely listeners, wrote in with some corrections to what I said on that episode. So, whoops. You can find us on Twitter at Screentone Club. You can also email us, show@screentone.club. My name is Elliot Page. You can find me on Twitter at Elliot Page. And you can also, by the time this episode comes out, there will be a short video game being released by myself. To find out more about it, you can go to questionable.systems. Yes, that is a URL. Yes, I love dumb URLs. Andy, how about you?
Yep, you can find me on Twitter at Hannahs1979.
Cool. Thank you very much for listening as always, and good night.
Bye, everyone.